The envelope was cream-colored and expensive. Daniel Carter stood in his hallway, still wearing his teaching clothes, chalk dust still faint on his sleeve, holding it like something was wrong. Inside a wedding invitation. Brittany's name printed in gold script beside a man he'd never met. Then he found the handwritten note tucked beneath it. Daniel, I wanted you to see what my life has become. I know this is hard for you, poor thing, but maybe it'll inspire you to finally do something with yours. The woman who walked out on him and their 7-year-old son was mailing him sympathy. She called him poor. She signed it with a heart. What Brittany didn't know was that the man she pitied had been carrying a secret one that would make every person in that wedding hall question everything they thought they knew about him. But yes, the invitation sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Daniel Carter touched it again. Not because he forgot it was there. He saw it every morning when he reached past it for the coffee maker every evening, when he set Jake's dinner plate down on the same scratched laminate surface. It was cream-colored and slightly oversized, the kind of stationery that cost more per sheet than Daniel spent on groceries for a week. He left it there on purpose. He wasn't sure why. Jake had already asked about it once. "What's that, Dad?" And Daniel had said it was junk mail. Jake had believed him without a second glance, already distracted by the cartoon playing on the second-hand television in the corner. 7-year-olds had the mercy of short attention spans. Daniel envied that. On the 4th morning, he finally picked it up. He already knew what was inside. He'd read it the night it arrived, standing in the hallway, still in his jacket, chalk still faint on his sleeve from 3rd period. But reading something once and sitting with it were 2 different things. The cardstock was heavy in his hands. Brittany Harmon and Trevor Caldwell request the honor of your presence. The font was gold. Of course it was gold. And beneath the card, folded once the handwritten note he'd been trying not to think about. Daniel, I wanted you to see what my life has become. I know this is hard for you, poor thing, but maybe it'll inspire you to finally do something with yours. He set it back down, poured his coffee, heard Jake's alarm go off down the hall. That was the rhythm of their life, his and Jake's alarms, coffee backpacks, the short drive to Maplewood Elementary, in the 12-year-old Honda that needed a new muffler. Daniel taught 5th grade there. Jake was in 2nd grade in the same building, a different wing on the ground floor. Every morning, Daniel dropped him at the front entrance and watched until the door closed before pulling out of the drop-off lane. It was a small thing. He never missed it. Their apartment had 1 bedroom. Jake slept there. Daniel had converted the living room years ago, his bed tucked against the wall behind a bookshelf that also held Jake's baseball trophies, and a framed drawing Jake had made in kindergarten, a house 2 stick figures a sun with too many rays. The apartment was not much, but it was theirs, and it was clean, and on Friday nights they made homemade pizza and watched whatever Jake had been saving up to show him all week. Nobody looking at Daniel Carter's life would have guessed at the other thing. His attorney knew, his financial advisor knew, and his grandmother had known before she passed. 2 years ago, she was the one who made him promise. Stay in the real work, she'd told him, her hand dry and warm around his. Stay with real people. 10 years. Don't let the money decide who you are before you've had the chance to figure that out yourself. He had sold the educational software company he'd spent 6 years building quietly through a private acquisition that never made the news, and the number that landed in his account afterward was one that still occasionally surprised him when he thought about it directly. $18 million. He kept living the same life he'd been living, drove the same car, shopped at the same thrift stores, because his grandmother had asked him to. And because, if he was honest, he didn't yet know who he would be without the structure of ordinary days. Brittany had walked out 18 months ago. She hadn't known about any of it, the company, the sale, none of it. She had left a man she believed was a 5th grade teacher with a used Honda and no particular trajectory, and that was the version of him she had been carrying ever since. Or so he'd thought. He didn't start looking into Trevor Caldwell out of jealousy. He told himself it was practicality. Brittany's choices affected Jake at least in theory, and a man in that position had a right to know who might be entering his son's orbit. He spent one evening with a laptop and a public records database, the kind any person could access for the price of a monthly subscription. What he found took the air out of the room. Trevor Caldwell was a reconstructive surgeon with a practice in Connecticut, 2 luxury cars registered to his name, and a lifestyle that photographed beautifully on social media. He was also carrying a malpractice suit that had been quietly proceeding for 18 months, a second civil complaint filed by a former business partner, and a debt load that, between the mortgage on the Connecticut house, the leased office space, and the financing on both vehicles, left almost no actual equity beneath the polished surface. The man looked like money. He was structured like a house of cards. Daniel closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of the living room for a long time. He wasn't sure what he felt. Not satisfaction that would have required him to still care about Brittany in the way that made her choices sting. And somewhere in the past 18 months, that particular nerve had gone numb. What he felt was something closer to tired. Tired of the story she was apparently telling about him, the one where he was the cautionary tale, the man who couldn't keep up the poor thing, who needed inspiring. He had let her tell it, because correcting it had seemed like more effort than it was worth, because Jake didn't need to see his father performing dignity for an audience, because Daniel had genuinely believed that the truth would arrange itself eventually, the way things tended to do. But the note had been something different. That had been deliberate. He found the journal by accident the same night. He'd been looking for Jake's pediatric insurance card in the box of documents he kept in the closet, the box that also held apparently a slim leather-bound notebook he didn't recognize, pushed to the back behind a folder of tax returns. Brittany must have left it when she cleared out her things, overlooked in whatever the emotional arithmetic of that particular afternoon had been. He almost put it back. He told himself later that what stopped him was the date on the first page almost 2 years ago, more than 3 months before she'd told him she wanted out. He opened it to that page and started reading. By the time he reached the end, Jake had been asleep for 2 hours. Daniel was still sitting on the closet floor. It wasn't just the confirmation that she'd planned to leave long before she said anything, though that was there in her own handwriting, detailed and methodical. It was the way she'd written about Jake. Not as a child she was leaving behind with a heavy heart, not even as an afterthought, as a complication. The Jake situation she'd written in one entry needs to be handled cleanly. Handled. The word had the texture of a business memo. Their son, their actual son, who slept with a worn, stuffed dog named Captain and still asked Daniel to check the closet before bed, was a situation to be handled cleanly. Daniel set the journal on the kitchen counter, next to the wedding invitation. He looked at the 2 objects together for a moment. Then he went to the window and stood there, looking out at the Philadelphia street below the amber glow of the streetlights on wet pavement, a city quietly doing what cities did at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. He thought about his grandmother, about the 10-year promise which he'd been keeping for 3 years now, with 7 more to go. He thought about Jake asking that morning whether they could get a dog, not a big one, Dad, just a medium one, and how Daniel had said maybe and meant it. He thought about what it meant that he had been walking around as the subject of Brittany's story without ever once deciding whether he wanted to be in it at all. His phone was on the counter. He picked it up and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 2 months, Ashley Mercer. They'd been friends since college. She'd gone on to build a consulting career in Los Angeles, while Daniel had gone in the opposite direction in every measurable sense. She knew about the company. She was one of the only people who did. It rang twice. "It's late," Ashley said by way of greeting. "I know." He looked at the journal and the invitation on the counter. "I need to tell you something." He heard her shift, settle the small sound of someone who'd just decided to stop whatever else they were doing. "Then tell me." "I got a wedding invitation today," he said. "From Brittany." A beat. "Okay." She included a note. Called me poor thing. said she hoped her happiness would inspire me to do something with my life. Ashley's voice came back even precise. And what are you going to do? Daniel looked out the window again. Down the hall, Jake made a small sound in his sleep, one of those half-formed words children said in dreams, meaning everything and nothing. I found her journal, he said quietly. Ashley. She planned all of it. The timeline, the exit, even how she talked about Jake. It's all in there in her handwriting. This time, the silence from the other end had a different quality to it. When Ashley spoke again, her voice was careful and still. What do you want to do, Daniel? He turned away from the window. For the first time since he'd opened the envelope 4 days ago, something settled in his chest. Not anger, not even resolve exactly. Something quieter than both of those things. Something that had been waiting. I think, he said, it's time. The story Brittany was telling had a shape to it. Daniel learned the contours of it through Ashley, who had spent the 2 weeks after that late-night phone call quietly listening at the edges of their shared social circles. The people who had known both Daniel and Brittany during the marriage. The mutual friends who still followed Brittany's life, the way people followed a reality show they knew was scripted, but watched anyway. The version of Daniel that existed in Brittany's retelling was a specific kind of sad man who had not handled the divorce well, who had called her repeatedly in the early months, who had, according to one story, Ashley heard at a gathering in New Jersey, shown up at Brittany's old workplace just to see her. A man who still hadn't found his footing. A man who needed, as Brittany had written, in her note, some inspiration. None of it was true. Daniel hadn't called Brittany more than twice after the papers were signed both times about Jake's school enrollment forms. He hadn't been to her old workplace. He had in fact been almost aggressively undramatic about the entire thing, which he now understood had left a vacuum that Brittany had filled with whatever narrative suited her. She's been at it for a while, Ashley told him over the phone one evening, her voice careful. It's not new. She's been building this version of you since before the divorce was finalized. Daniel was grading math quizzes at the kitchen table. He set down his pen. And people believe it. Some of them, the ones who don't know you well enough to ask better questions. He thought about that, about all the dinners and birthday parties and casual Sunday afternoons where someone who'd heard Brittany's story had looked at him with that particular soft expression, the one that was almost sympathy, but had just enough condescension folded into it to leave a taste. It was Jake who broke something open in him 3 days before the wedding. They were in the car on the way home from Jake's Saturday baseball practice, the Honda rattling slightly at intersections the way it always did Jake, in the back seat, still in his cleats, dirt on his knees. He'd been quiet for most of the drive, which usually meant he was either tired or working something out. Then, without looking up from the water bottle he was turning in his hands, he asked, "Is Mom going to come see me at her wedding?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Where'd you hear about the wedding, bud?" Tommy's mom said something. Jake turned the water bottle another half rotation. She looked at me kind of weird when she said it. Daniel pulled into their parking spot and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment with his hand still on the key. Then he turned around in his seat so he could look at his son directly. "I don't know if Mom has plans to see you there," he said, "but I know that whatever happens, it has nothing to do with how much you're worth. You understand me." Jake looked at him for a long moment. That particular look he had sometimes too old for his face. "Are you going?" "Yeah," Daniel said. "I'm going." Jake nodded slowly like he was filing that away somewhere. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the door handle already shifting back into the register of a 7-year-old. "Can we have pizza tonight?" "We can have pizza tonight," Daniel said. He watched Jake run ahead toward the building entrance cleats, clicking against the pavement, and something in Daniel's chest went quiet and clear. Whatever happened at that wedding, however it looked, and whatever it cost, Jake had looked at him in that car and found something solid. Daniel intended to keep it that way. That same evening he made 2 calls. The first was to his neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, who had watched Jake a handful of times before, and whose presence Jake tolerated with the particular affection he reserved for people who kept good snacks. She agreed without hesitation. The second call was to Ashley. "Bring the journal," she said, before he could finish explaining his thinking. "I wasn't sure." "Bring it," Ashley said. "Not to use it as a weapon, just so she knows that you know. There's a difference." She let that settle. "And Daniel let me handle the toasts. I have a few things to say." Ashley flew in from Los Angeles 2 days before the event. She didn't announce it as a grand gesture. She texted landing Friday afternoon. "Already have a dress. Don't argue with me." He hadn't been planning to argue. They took a car service to the venue, a restored estate in Connecticut, that Brittany had almost certainly selected because it photographed beautifully from the outside. The car that met them at the airport was a Rolls-Royce, arranged through Daniel's private account, the first visible evidence of the life he had kept carefully off stage. Ashley had raised an eyebrow when she saw it waiting at the curb, but said nothing. She'd known about the money for years. She simply hadn't seen it expressed as a material fact before. Daniel wore a Tom Ford tuxedo he'd had fitted in New York the previous week, charcoal clean, understated, in the way that only very expensive things could afford to be understated. Ashley was in a deep navy gown, long and architectural, the kind of dress that made a room reorient around the person wearing it. They did not talk much on the ride over. There was a particular quality to the quiet between them, not tension, but the kind of focused calm that precedes something irreversible. The estate's circular drive was lined with guests arriving in stages, town cars, a few rented luxury vehicles, the usual performance of a certain class of occasion. When the Rolls pulled up, and Daniel stepped out and offered his hand to Ashley, the shift was immediate. Heads turned. Conversations dropped half a register. Someone near the entrance stopped mid-sentence. Daniel didn't look for Brittany. He didn't have to. He heard the sound, a specific silence. Aya held breath, and then he saw her from across the courtyard. She was standing near the entrance in a champagne-colored wrap, a glass in her hand, surrounded by a small constellation of guests. Her eyes found him the way eyes found something they weren't prepared for. The glass shifted slightly in her grip. Trevor stood beside her, tall, polished, the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the most impressive person in a room. He was watching Daniel with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite succeeding. Daniel offered a pleasant nod in their direction, the way you acknowledge someone you've seen at a party before, then turned his attention to Ashley and said something that made her laugh, genuine, unforced, and the two of them walked inside together. The cocktail hour became a different event from the one Brittany had planned. It wasn't anything Daniel engineered deliberately. It was simply that the story her guests had been told about the quiet, struggling ex-husband who taught elementary school and couldn't get his life together did not match the man standing in the room, and people's minds encountering that contradiction naturally began to ask questions. A woman who turned out to be the mother of one of Daniel's former students recognized him and pulled him into a conversation about the educational software her daughter's school had been using for 2 years. A man who worked in private equity introduced himself with the particular attentiveness of someone who had just revised an assumption. Ashley moved beside Daniel with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in her own skin, which made the two of them together read not as a statement, but as simply real. Brittany found him during the cocktail hour near the edge of the garden terrace, where the guests had thinned out. "I didn't expect you to actually come," she said. Her voice was controlled, professionally controlled, the kind of even tone that took effort. "You invited me," Daniel said. "I didn't think you'd—" She stopped, reset. "You came with Ashley Mercer." "I did." Brittany looked out at the garden for a moment. When she turned back, her expression had rearranged itself into something softer, more familiar, the version of her face he'd known in the early years of the marriage, before he'd learned to recognize it as a mode she switched into when she needed something. "Daniel, you've clearly done well for yourself. I'm glad. I always believed you had it in you. We weren't right for each other at the time. Brittany, his voice was quiet. You don't need to do this. Do what? Revise the story in real time. Her jaw tightened slightly. I wrote you that note because I was worried about you. I genuinely was. You wrote me that note. He said, because you wanted me to feel small. And it almost worked. He said it without heat the way you state a fact about weather. But almost isn't the same thing. She shifted toward him, then dropping the social register, going for something more direct. We could have had all of this together, you know, if things had been different. If you'd been further along when we had Jake, he said. That's what we had together. And Jake is doing fine. Her expression moved through something complicated at that. I still care about him. I want you to know that. Then show him, Daniel said simply. That's all there is to it. He excused himself before she could respond, and walked back toward the main hall. His phone buzzed as he crossed the threshold, a text from Ashley, who had watched the exchange from across the terrace without appearing to watch it at all. You don't owe her an explanation. You don't owe her that. He read it twice, then put the phone in his jacket pocket and felt something in his shoulders. He hadn't realized was braced, finally let go. The reception dinner was elegant and overstretched, the budget visible in the right places and strained in the others, the signature cocktail slightly too sweet. The floral arrangements magnificent in a way that made you notice how magnificent they were, which was one layer too many. Daniel ate his meal and talked to the people around him, and if any of those people had come in with a fixed idea of who he was, most of them had revised it quietly by the salad course. The MC had opened the floor to toasts during the dessert course, and Ashley had slipped him a note earlier that evening, asking to be added to the list. She'd introduced herself simply as a longtime friend of Daniel's, which was accurate, and which gave the room just enough context to be curious. She stood up, and the room gave her its attention the way rooms did when someone rose with that particular quality of stillness, and she began to speak. She didn't mention Brittany by name. She didn't attack anyone, didn't perform outrage, didn't give the room the dramatic confrontation it might have expected. What she did was describe a man. She talked about the scholarship fund Daniel had been quietly financing for 3 years. Anonymous donations that had put 17 kids through programs they otherwise couldn't have accessed. She mentioned the family in their neighborhood, whose hospital bills had disappeared 1 month after the father lost his job, paid by someone who had asked the hospital to list the source only as a private donor. She talked about the way Daniel Carter showed up to teach 5th grade every single morning, not because he had to, not because it was the only option available to him, but because he believed that the most important room he could be in was the one with the children who most needed someone to show up consistently. She didn't editorialize, she just named the facts. Then she looked out at the room, at the faces that had reoriented at Brittany, sitting very still at the head table at Trevor, whose expression had gone somewhere private and difficult, and she said evenly without cruelty, "This man didn't come here tonight to prove anything. He came because he was invited, and he'll leave with everything that actually matters to him intact." She sat down. The room held its quiet for a moment that was 1 beat longer than comfortable, the kind of silence that means something has landed and cannot be unlanded. Then conversation resumed carefully in lower registers, and Daniel reached across the table and placed his hand briefly over Ashley's. She turned and looked at him. Neither of them said anything. At the head table, Brittany set her fork down on her plate with a soft, precise sound. Trevor leaned toward her and said something near her ear. She didn't answer him. Outside the tall windows, the Connecticut evening had gone full dark, the estate's exterior lights throwing amber pools across the lawn. Somewhere beyond all of it, in a Philadelphia apartment with 1 bedroom and a bookshelf full of baseball trophies, a 7-year-old with a worn, stuffed dog named Captain was sleeping at Mrs. Paulson's without any idea that tonight his father had finally quietly decided to take up the full amount of space he was owed. The knock came at 7:43 in the morning. Daniel knew it was her before he opened the door. There was only one person who would come to a hotel room at that hour the morning after her own wedding, and the specific quality of the knock 3 times. Not hard enough to be aggressive, too deliberate to be casual, carried the signature of someone who had rehearsed it in the elevator on the way up. He opened the door. Brittany stood in the hallway in yesterday's makeup imperfectly removed, wearing a cream blouse and dark slacks that were clearly not what she'd slept in. She had the look of a person who had been awake for most of the night and had spent the early morning hours reconstructing enough composure to make an appearance. It was a convincing reconstruction. It always had been. "Can I come in?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Daniel stepped back from the doorway. Ashley was seated at the small table near the window, a coffee cup in both hands. Her navy gown from the night before, replaced by a simple gray pullover and jeans. She looked at Brittany without expression, not hostile, not warm, the particular neutrality of someone who had already decided the most useful thing she could do was simply be present and let the room speak for itself. Brittany registered Ashley's presence with a single glance and then directed her attention back to Daniel, who had moved to stand near the foot of the bed, his arms loose at his sides. "Trevor and I argued through the night," Brittany said. "Your friend's little speech." She caught herself recalibrated. People were asking him questions afterward, about us, about finances, about things that are private. "Ashley told people the truth about me," Daniel said. "That's different from telling them anything about you." It was this whole room full of his family's colleagues, and she stood up and... Brittany's voice thinned slightly at the edges. She pressed forward through it. "I need to know what you're planning to do with what you know, about Trevor's situation, about the journal." Daniel crossed to the desk and picked up the journal, the leather cover soft from handling carried in his jacket's interior pocket since he'd left Philadelphia. He set it on the surface between them without opening it. Brittany looked at it. Something moved across her face that was not quite the expression she'd arrived wearing. "I read all of it," Daniel said. "You know that, Daniel. The part where you called Jake a situation that needed to be handled cleanly." He said it without raising his voice, the way he might read a passage aloud to his class, measured clear, giving the words room to exist on their own. "I want you to understand that I'm not angry about what you wrote about me. I made my peace with how you saw our marriage a long time ago. But that part," he touched the journal's cover briefly, "that part I'm going to carry with me for a while." Brittany's composure held, but it was working harder than it had been a moment ago. "I was in a bad place when I wrote some of those things. People write things they don't mean." "You wrote it across 11 entries over 4 months, Daniel said. "That's a pattern, not a bad night." She was quiet. She looked at the journal, then at Ashley, then back at Daniel. The architecture of the argument she'd brought into the room with her was not holding the way she'd planned, and something in her expression shifted to acknowledge this, not dramatically, but in the small, precise way that a person's face changes when they stop performing and start actually reckoning. When she spoke again, her voice had lost most of its rehearsed quality. "I thought coming here would... I don't know what I thought." She looked at her hands briefly. "What we had together wasn't nothing. I know I made choices that I know they hurt Jake. I know that." Her voice caught slightly on his name, and this time, Daniel didn't try to determine whether it was genuine. It didn't matter the way it once had. "But you've clearly built something real, and I suppose I wanted to understand how." "You already know how," Daniel said, not unkindly. "You just made different choices." She absorbed that, then quietly, almost to herself, "Are you happy?" It was such a different question from the ones she'd come in with that it landed differently than anything else she'd said. "I'm getting there," Daniel said. "Yeah." She nodded once, slowly. Then she looked at Ashley, a longer look this time, not combative, something closer to a reckoning, and Ashley met it without flinching and without cruelty, just steady and clear-eyed the way she'd been all weekend. Brittany turned back to Daniel. "I'm going to figure things out," she said. It sounded less like a statement intended for him than one she was making for herself. "I hope you do," Daniel said, and meant it. She left. Daniel stood in the room after the door closed and listened to the sound of the hallway returning to ordinary hotel quiet. Ashley wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said nothing, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require filling. After a moment, he sat down across from her at the small table and reached for his own coffee gone lukewarm. "You okay?" Ashley asked. "Yeah," he said. And then, because it was true, actually, yeah. The news arrived in pieces over the following 2 weeks, the way these things always did, not in a single dramatic disclosure, but in a series of quiet dominoes. Trevor had found the journal. Daniel didn't know how, didn't ask, and later reflected that it didn't particularly matter. The truth had its own gravitational pull and eventually collected what belonged to it. Trevor's family, who had been the primary financial architecture behind his practice, withdrew from 2 joint investments following conversations that nobody made public. Brittany's employer, a marketing firm, where she'd been handling expense accounts for 4 years, opened an internal audit that was, as these audits tended to be, about something that had been accumulating long before anyone looked directly at it. The marriage that had been announced in gold script on cream cardstock became within a month a legal arrangement between 2 people managing separate crises. Daniel heard most of this secondhand through Ashley, who heard it through the remaining threads of their shared social world. He didn't seek the information out. He received it the way you received weather reports about a city you used to live in, noted, processed, and ultimately not particularly relevant to where you were standing now. He sent Brittany one text message 3 weeks after the wedding. "I hope you find stable ground. Jake is doing well. He'll be at the same number if you want to reach him." Then he blocked her contact. Not in anger. Anger had left the building some time ago. In the same spirit that you closed a window when a draft had been coming through it for too long. The room didn't need to be sealed. It just needed the draft to stop. What happened between Daniel and Ashley was not a single moment. It was an accumulation of small ones, the way most real things were. It was the phone calls that started going longer, conversations that had always been substantive between them, but now had a different quality, the way a familiar road feels different when you're no longer in a hurry. It was Ashley asking about Jake with the specificity of someone who was actually tracking his development, remembering that he'd been anxious about the multiplication tables, asking 2 weeks later whether they'd clicked yet. It was the Thursday evening she called from Los Angeles at 9 o'clock, her time, which was midnight. His, and they talked for an hour and 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and when they finally said goodnight, there was a beat at the end that neither of them filled with a word. It was the morning she texted, "I have a client in New York next Thursday. I could drive down to Philadelphia after." He'd replied, "Jake's been asking when you're coming back." Her response had taken 4 minutes. Just Jake. His had taken 6. No. She drove down on a Thursday evening and stayed through Sunday afternoon sleeping on the pull-out sofa, because that was the only option the apartment offered, and the 3 of them moved through the weekend with an ease that felt less like something being built than something being recognized. They went to the farmer's market Saturday morning, Jake running ahead between the stalls, circling back every few minutes to show them something he'd found. They cooked dinner together Saturday night, Jake assigned to tearing lettuce for the salad, a task he took with extreme seriousness, and ate at the scratched laminate table while Jake held court on the relative merits of every player on his baseball team. Sunday afternoon, Jake sat on the kitchen counter watching Ashley braid a section of her hair with the focused attention he gave to things he was genuinely trying to understand. At some point, he'd started calling her Coach Ashley. It had started the previous visit when she'd spent 20 minutes in the parking lot helping him work on his batting stance, and the name had stuck in the way that children's names for people stuck compressing affection into a single word. By the 3rd visit, it had shortened further, somewhere between Coach and her name proper, into something that sounded like Co-Ashley, and Ashley had answered to it without correction, which meant it was permanent. Co-Ashley. Jake said, still watching her hands in her hair. Do you have a house in Los Angeles? I have an apartment, she said. Is it bigger than ours? A little bit. Jake considered this. Do you like it there? Ashley's hand stilled in her hair. She looked at Daniel, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, with an expression she later told him was the most unguarded she'd ever seen on his face. She turned back to Jake. It's okay, she said. But I think I like it better here. Jake nodded, accepting this as settled. Then he looked at Daniel with the specific gravity of a child who is determined something should be said out loud and has elected himself to say it. Dad, he said, Co-Ashley looks at you the same way you look at me. Daniel set down the dish towel he'd been holding. He looked at his son for a moment, this small, clear-eyed person who had navigated the last 18 months with a grace that regularly astounded him. And then he looked at Ashley, who was sitting very still, with her hands in her lap, and something quiet and open on her face. Yeah, Daniel said. I know. 6 months later, Daniel drove a white Tesla to Maplewood Elementary on a Tuesday morning that smelled like early spring, the particular sharpness of air that had finally decided to stop being winter. Jake, now 8, was in the passenger seat, conducting an elaborate argument in favor of getting a dog that was more structured and footnoted than most of Daniel's students' book reports. A medium one, Jake clarified. Not small, because small dogs are nervous. Not big, because we don't have a yard yet. Medium is the logical choice. You've given this significant thought, Daniel said. I've given this a lot of thought, Jake confirmed. The school came into view at the end of the block. The sign out front had a new addition beneath the Maplewood Elementary name, a small panel recently installed that read, "In partnership with the Margaret Carter Educational Foundation." Margaret had been his grandmother's name. The foundation had been announced publicly the previous month, a scholarship and equipment fund serving under-resourced schools across the Philadelphia district. Daniel's attorney had handled the paperwork. Daniel had handled the rest. He pulled into the drop-off lane. Jake unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for his backpack, then stopped and looked at his father with the expression he reserved for things he'd been thinking about longer than he'd been letting on. Is Co-Ashley going to be here for my game on Saturday? She's flying in Friday night. Jake absorbed this. Is she going to keep flying back and forth, or we're figuring that out, Daniel said. Jake looked at him for one more moment, evaluating the honesty of this answer, then apparently decided it was satisfactory. He pushed the door open and jumped down to the curb, turning back once to look up at the foundation sign on the school's front panel. She would have liked that, he said, meaning his great-grandmother. Right, Dad. Yeah, Daniel said. She would have liked that. Jake nodded, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and ran toward the entrance. Daniel watched the door until it closed. Then he sat in the idling car in the empty drop-off lane for a moment, the morning light coming in at a low angle through the windshield, the city doing what it did on ordinary Tuesday mornings. His phone lit up on the console. Ashley, a text that said, "Only good morning. Tell Jake I said hi." He typed back. He already asked about Saturday. You've been adopted? 3 dots. Then worst thing that's ever happened to me. He was still smiling when he pulled out of the drop-off lane and headed back around the building to the faculty lot. Some mornings were just mornings, and some mornings you drove past a sign with your grandmother's name on it and got a text from someone who looked at you the way he looked at his kid, and those mornings had a different weight to them, not heavier exactly. Fuller. The kind of full that didn't ask to be explained or performed or announced to anyone. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. And Daniel Carter, who had spent 3 years quietly learning the difference between the life that looked like something and the life that actually was something, drove to work in the thin March light and felt without ceremony or audience entirely like himself.